Hello, and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. My name is Jose Luis Granado Seca, a Mexican-born journalist living and working in Mexico City, and I'm also a co-host over at the Venezuela Analysis Podcast. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, how you doing? Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. My name's Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of... Wait a minute.
What?
No.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm Jose Luis.
Are you sure?
I think I'm pretty sure. You're Kurt Hackbarth.
All right, so we got to mix this up.
Okay, jeez.
Sorry.
Oh, that's much better. Much better. Much more comfortable.
Whew, Soberanía.
It doesn't seem right coming out of my mouth. You got to be the one to deliver.
What can I say?
All right, we're back here and in person together, working on some things here in Mexico City. Can't tell you yet, but it's going to be exciting. Hopefully, we got something new coming for you. So that's why we're here together. And of course, we got a lot to talk about on today's show. I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share here to talk about the content for this week's program. We're going to open with a conversation about a rogue judge who looks to try to jail the president. I mean,
as crazy as that sounds.
As crazy as that sounds. Yeah. We warned that the opposition was flirting with dangerous rhetoric and would pursue the undemocratic path, and looks like, once again, more evidence of that. We'll be talking about Garcia Luna, who was sentenced last week.
The former security minister for Felipe Calderon.
Former president.
Yeah.
And, it made a lot of noise here in Mexico. Actually, it felt like there was more noise around the sentencing than his actual conviction.
Interestingly.
Oddly enough, yeah. We're going to talk about Trump and his lies about auto plants here in Mexico that don't really exist, but he insists that they do, or that he stopped, but then that they weren't built. Anyway, we'll sort it out. We have a new social program that was announced recently, 1 million new homes, so follow through on that. We're going to give you some information, and our two regular segments, losers and haters, and good news from Mexico, with the order reversed. All right. So let's start with this story around this judge. So there is a judge who has basically said that if you don't do as I say, you're going to go to jail. And that's the links that the opposition is currently going to when it comes to judicial reform. And I know we've talked a lot about the judicial reform here on the program, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. But as we know, judges will now be elected by the popular vote. The remaining branch of government that was not directly elected by the people will now be elected. That is now the Constitution. Right? The Constitution has been changed. As we explained previously, Mexico operates under a system of a permanent constituent assembly. So basically, there's always the possibility of reforming the Constitution without calling for a referendum or having a constituent assembly like other nations have to do. And the Constitution has reformed, but
it's over.
It's over. I mean, that's the part we have to really stress here. But there are still some voices out there that are insisting that that is not the case, that they can still stop what is essentially the dictate, the mandate that is coming from the people. So there's been a lot of, we call them amparos. It's kind of like a temporary injunction. It's basically where someone can solicit the state to intervene so that their rights are not violated. But of course, the law is very clear. There's a law of the amparo that specifically says you cannot apply the amparo against constitutional reforms, but that's not stopping some of them from actually trying to insist that they have the power to override the will of the voters. And I have to remind you that nearly 60% of the population voted for Claudia Sheinbaum as president. They won a supermajority in the Congress and, of course, have the mandate to carry this out, and they did. So there is this one particular judge, though, has literally threatened the president with arrest, saying that if you don't obey my order, you're in desacato or disobeying an order of the court, and you can be jailed as a result. Obviously, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, let's be clear. This is not going to happen. Okay, Claudia Sheinbaum is not going to be jailed 1 month into her administration, but it just goes to show the links to which, right, the judges will go, right, this reductive of judicial power, to try to prevent, a done deal, a constitutional reform that's a done deal. This is not the first time we've talked about in this program. They tried to freeze the legislative debate. Freeze. Okay. Don't debate it. They tried to freeze the bill coming out of committee and heading onto the floor. They tried to freeze it going from the floor to the state legislators to be ratified. Of course, none of those passed because you can't put an injunction against a constitutional reform. That's just it. You can't. There's no gray area on this one, right? But what they're trying to do is they're trying to take advantage of the fact that most people don't know that. Most people, aren't really aware of how the system works, right? And especially abroad, right? They either don't know or they're willingly ignorant, in a lot of media circles. So they try to play it off that you can put an injunction against anything, even a reform to the Constitution, to try to present Claudia Sheinbaum as disobeying a direct order of the court. Now, we were asking a week or so ago if the Supreme Court was going to try this, because the Supreme Court had admitted, right, had admitted a procedure, and they were going to vote to see if they were going to do it themselves. What they've decided to do so far, the Supreme Court, is hands off, not do it themselves, but have a lower order judge try it, right? So the Supreme Court doesn't get their hands dirty, right? They have a lower order judge try it. And what kind of a judge, someone with a whole laundry list of disciplinary problems, right? A whole laundry list of disciplinary problems. And here it is, right? 3 investigations against Nancy Juarez Salas, right, for negative conduct and deficient performance, failure to complete with her job, with nepotism and workplace harassment, not respecting workers' rights, right? And she was actually going to be sanctioned for this, and the sanction was actually revoked by the Consejo de Judicatura, which was the council over, theoretically entrusted with disciplining judges, which it never did, right? So this Nancy Juarez is effectively the poster judge for why the judicial reform is necessary in the first place, right? Why it's so fundamentally necessary. 12 denunciations by public servants against this judge. 12, right? Leading to a suspension that was then revoked, because judges before this reform in Mexico could get away with anything. Could get away with absolutely anything. And they did. You actually saw this judge out at a rally, vociferating against the judicial reform when Lopez Obrador was in town, right? I mean, this kind of behavior, right? So what does she have to lose, right? Throw the amparo out there and, trust that you will have a friendly national and international media that will muddy the waters around something that is very clear-cut. You can't place an injunction against a constitutional amendment. Just think about it. Just think about it logically, right? If judges could place an injunction against any constitutional amendment, they could effectively rewrite the Constitution, right? Why can't they place an injunction against any of the other constitutional amendments that are coming down the pike? Why not? What would stop them at that point to place an injunction against any law, any reform, any amendment, anything? Nothing to stop them at that point, right? What they want to do is have Sheinbaum bend. This is her first test of real mettle here. Besides some of the violence issues that we'll also, get into at some other point, right? They want her to bend. She's been in office for barely a month, and they'll say, okay, I'll obey the injunction, and we'll wait for the whole injunction process to go through, and we'll go up to the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court decide, and maybe they'll decide one way, maybe they'll decide the other. But at that point, the clock will have run out for the judicial elections for this coming year, for 2025.
Right. And as we see here on the screen, this headline, where Claudia Sheinbaum is calling out for what it is. This is a campaign. This is clearly a strategy. This judge is either an active participant or has lended herself to this charade. And it's really disappointing that one of the ways that she has tried to defend her act in this situation has been saying, no, our job as judges is to protect human rights. In Mexico, there was a very important reform in 2011, which basically elevated the place of human rights inside of the Constitution, basically really kind of making that the mission of the Supreme Court of the Constitution to protect human rights. Now, this judge is saying, well, I'm just trying to protect the labor rights of the people who were affected by this, right? And it's really disappointing to use this kind of rhetoric, what is essentially, as I explained in previous episodes, a reactionary position, a position that actually denies the advancement of human rights in their totality in this country. And we actually saw...
my human right to make $20,000 a month.
That's basically what they're arguing, right? Like, it's not actually talking about what we understand human rights to actually be. And we've talked about him previously on the show. I call him the world's worst human rights offender, Emilio Alvarez y Casa, and he was saying, "Here we have it. We have the proof. This president doesn't respect human rights. This president is disobeying a court." Right? This is the campaign, right? To try to portray Claudia Sheinbaum as an authoritarian who is ignoring a lawful order from the court. That is not the case whatsoever. As we saw in this previous headline, and I agree with, the people who are not respecting the law in this situation
Are the judges.
The ones who are trying to subvert the will of 36 million people, one person, to protect the privileges of a tiny group. This is what the
With
situation
no legal foundation whatsoever. Trying to, bluff procedural liberals with blinkers on to fall for this argument, because it's a BS procedural argument that has actually nothing of substance to it, right? But they've tried to prepare the terrain over the last years with this idea of López Obrador is an authoritarian, López Obrador is an authoritarian, López Obrador is an authoritarian, to predispose people then to fall for these things when they come.
That's the strategy. That's the campaign. And of course, we've also seen a lot of voices out here. This is a member of the Supreme Court who is explaining basically that what they're saying doesn't fly. And so it's been good to also see the public debate. Something I was thinking about the other day. It's quite extraordinary that we've been talking about judicial reform for many, many weeks now.
Yeah.
This is the public debate. This is the public debate that's being held. And it's not just on this podcast or on the airwaves. It's happening amongst the population saying, you know what, like they're really engaging with this and that article of the Constitution saying, no, we have the right to reform it as we do. We are the sovereign. We are the permanent constituent assembly. Right? There's an elevated level of political discourse happening in Mexico. Who would have thought that this would be what we were discussing? In a way, they're almost doing us a favor. Right? They're really politicizing the situation in the country to the detriment of the opposition, because Claudia continues to rise in support amongst the population.
And it's a really important point too, because all of a sudden it's like, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? Now it's like, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know what the judges are doing? And that's such an important thing, because judicial power in so many places, Mexico included, and practically especially, has always been, based on this idea that they're acting behind closed doors, right? The robed class, the gowned class, right? And even if, the sessions are open, a lot of times they would pass, without people noticing, right? Those days are over, happily, right? People know their politicians by name, and they know their judges now. And that is so important. And it's not coincidental that one of the most important and less heralded parts of the judicial reform is requiring all sessions of the Supreme Court to be open and public. Because before, the Supreme Court could be separated, the 11 members of the Supreme Court, now 9, into what are called the salas especializadas, the specialized rooms, basically, where they could go off and make basically rulings with a couple of people, right? Before they would ever get to the pleno or the plenary of the Supreme Court. Those were private. Those sessions were private. So dealing with things like rich people evading taxes.
And then publishing it on Saturday when no one's around to protest it.
So those private little salas, those private little salons, those are over too. And that's part of it, right? Lo público cada vez más público, as López Obrador constantly said, making public affairs ever more public.
Imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, there you have it. You have a judge acting in a rogue-like manner, who's trying to jail the president, making these absurd accusations. It's not going to fly. That is the Constitution. The judicial reform is a done deal. And hopefully we can move on from it. But moving on. We have Garcia Luna being sentenced to 38 years for his role in narco-trafficking. Have to remember, first and foremost, this man was the right-hand man of Felipe Calderón in his failed war against the cartels. That is the point that we really want to stress on this program. This isn't just somebody who decided to betray the confidence of the government and of the president that he served. No, this was clearly somebody who was very well connected and is responsible in a U.S. court, finding him responsible for narco-trafficking. And it's an extraordinary penalty. I remember Maria Amparo Casar actually went on TV once saying, like, he could walk out of jail. None of the charges are really going to stick. And, it's just though he lied on his immigration form. Well, 38 years is a far cry from time served. He will be spending likely the rest of his life, we hope, in prison. But of course, who's next, right? That's the question we should be asking, because we've already seen a response from Felipe Calderon.
I didn't know.
I never had verifiable evidence of his involvement in illicit activities. That is a claim that is virtually impossible to believe.
Especially considering what we've talked about in this program and, in my articles and others, right? That Roberta Jacobson, the former ambassador, said, we knew and the Mexican government knew and didn't do anything about it, right? And, she said it, she said the quiet part out loud, right? We have articles, we have with the, backed up that the DEA knew, right? And the FBI, which was friends with Garcia Luna, going back well before his time with Calderon, stretching back to his time at the Federal Investigation Agency, the AFI, and the Federal Police. Right? Yet, the DEA and the FBI and the CIA all gave him reconocimientos, recognitions for his service, right? In 2004 and 2005, and then the CIA in 2012 as he was leaving office. And not only that, but former members, one each of those agencies, then joined up with Garcia Luna as business partners in his security agency post leaving office, right? So the United States has their hands all over this. So it's impossible to say that the United States didn't know and that Felipe Calderon didn't know. Up on the screen here, we have my article in Jacobin from a couple of years ago, right? I'd like to just read a part of this, which I think is very important. And then we'll go back to Calderon in a second, right? So right here, it's not just a question of what U.S. officials heard. It's also a matter of what they saw, right? A former U.S. embassy official reports being invited to a party at Garcia Luna's house, only for the host to show off his collection of restored vintage automobiles to his American guests. A collection of automobiles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. How do you get that in a bureaucrat's salary? It was right in front of us, said the official, right? Astonishment quickly gave way, however, to the Roberta Jacobson excuse, but we didn't really have a choice about working with him. This is exactly what she said, right? We had the goods on him, but he was in office, so what could we do? Just imagine if Garcia Luna had been part of even a moderately center-left government in Latin America. Would they have had anywhere near that degree of lenience, of laxity, of kind of, boys will be boys, right? Can you imagine when the United States invents crimes against left-wing leaders in Latin America, and here you had someone committing actual crimes, and their excuse was, that was it, right? So let me continue here. The fact that the intelligence community had a pretty good idea of who Garcia Luna was did not stop its rank and file from working with him, or even, as it turned out, going into business with him. According to Reporte Indigo, which reviewed the websites of GL and Associates Consulting and its sister organization ICIT Security before they were taken down, among Garcia Luna's strategic partners, quote unquote, were ex-members of the DEA, the FBI, and the CIA. None of this should surprise us, but, it has to be said again and again. From the DEA, Larry Hollifield had been regional director for Mexico and Central America at the time Garcia Luna headed the AFI, the Federal Investigations Agency. The FBI's Carlos Villar had been the Bureau's legal attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico around the same time. And it's interesting that we just mentioned on a recent program the other person who'd been working as first secretary at the U.S. Embassy, right, who was a CIA operative and involved in, sex crimes. Nice bunch of people over there at the embassy, real swell bunch of people they have over there. But the name that truly raises eyebrows is Jose Rodriguez. Let's think and remember back to the George W. Bush administration, who ran the CIA torture program and destroyed some 92 videos with evidence of torture before becoming the public face and best-selling author defending the program. These were Garcia Luna's business associates. However thin the argument is, we couldn't do anything about it because he was a cabinet member. However thin that is, considering what the United States has done against other governments that they weren't in agreement with. However thin that argument is, all right, we'll give you that, right? Suponiendo sin conceder. We'll give you that one. But once he left office, office. Once he left office and was a private citizen again, and his whole record in office was there, and you knew all about it. And you still go into business with him even after he was no longer in office.
No scruples.
Yeah. Right? And Felipe Calderon, who is notoriously a control freak about every little detail, right? Álvaro Delgado over at Sin Embargo pointed out that he even, at cabinet meetings, gave slim fast milkshakes to a couple of people and the members of the cabinet who knew were trying to lose weight to that degree of control freakery. He was all over what was going on in the pond.
But he didn't know, Kirk. He didn't know. He didn't know.
So you can be all over your cabinet members. You can be all over what's going on in the party. But with your security minister, you had no idea. And then this man, Calderon, has the gall to come out with a Twitter string right after this verdict and say, what? I'd do it again.
Yeah, I'd do it again.
I'd do it again.
And Claudia Sheinbaum had a really good response to that, which is that, does that mean that you would hire Garcia Luna again? Would you make him your security chief again? Is that what you mean? Would you engage in this awful exercise that just led to tons of bloodshed in the country that we're still trying to dig ourselves out of? It's incredible. It's incredible. It's almost hard to believe. And we talked about here in this piece some of the associates of Garcia Luna who haven't abandoned him. It's incredible because one of them that you mentioned here actually wrote a letter backing him up saying, no, please don't make the sentences too heavy. How do you know that he hasn't been framed? Don't you know that López Obrador, he actually referred to López Obrador, even though he's not in office, as the president. He's not even keeping up with the latest news about Mexico. He has it out for Felipe Calderon, and therefore maybe this was all a grand scheme to try to, smear the former president Calderon. This is the level of analysis of depth that we actually can expect from these people. And not to mention, again, we have to emphasize this. These people had a lot of power, an extraordinary amount of power.
Yeah, right? This is the degree of analysis, and this is the degree of policy that emanates, right, from this crowd of people.
And of course, I do want to mention one thing here, which is that, people knew from the get-go. They knew who he was. They knew what he was up to. And there were voices that were calling him out. And I'm bringing this here on the screen of Fernando Noroña, who's the head of the Senate right now, member of Morena, very good public speaker. He directly confronted Garcia Luna in one of the hearings that he held back in the day.
Over a series of years.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh,
2009, 2010, 2011, right?
Yeah.
He brought the goods, too, the receipts, right? House title, all of his properties and such, right? One after the other, right?
Yeah. And of course, just to speak to some of the poor coverage, this is why, unfortunately, so few people actually know what's happening here in Mexico, is that there's this tweet from Benile Ramirez, who is lying by omission, right? She calls herself an investigative reporter, actually has a lot of influence working at Futuro Media.
Columbia journalism graduate.
Yeah, of course, right? Friends with Maria Hinojosa, who's still writing her fame from earlier years, saying, I'm still getting over everything that I felt during that audience of the sentencing, the judge saying, you have a double life, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think anybody before had ever talked like that to Garcia Luna. Lying by omission. This is not unknown information. Fernandez Noroña, at the very least, was always consistent on this. And this is what these kinds of journalists do. Benile, I will remind you, was also lying by omission in her coverage of Ayotzinapa, deliberately leaving out the commitment that the Morena-led governments had made to trying to find the truth. Of course, they didn't. That is a pending task. We want to remind Claudia Sheinbaum that needs to be addressed. But this acting as if it was more of the same and it was all a cover-up and they're all, I remember there was this interview that she did on Futuro Media. We're like, well, what changed? Like, how come we're only hearing about this now? She refused to say that López Obrador created the Truth Commission. Lying by omission, right? Again, doing it here. This is the quality of journalism you can expect from so-called investigative reporters that are actually political actors.
Now, in all of this context, there has been a degree of disappointment in some sectors in Mexico that he only got 38 years. Now, 38 years is probably going to be a life sentence, although not necessarily if there's reduction for time served. But, it's very likely that he didn't get the life sentence of the Chapo because he had been a buddy of these people. So he didn't get leniency as such, but, a little bit. And if he winds up then, being used as a witness in other cases, they could chop down his sentence more. right? And so this is just a reminder that when you effectively outsource your judicial system for high-profile criminals to the United States, they're not going to act in the interest of justice for the Mexican people. They're going to act in their own interest, the interest of the DAs, in their flashy headlines in the Southern District of New York, and their own, prerogatives, not the prerogatives of Mexican people. So that's why when people are saying Felipe Calderon is next, Felipe Calderon is next, yes, but not in the United States, in Mexico. And Mexico has to make sure that it creates a judicial system that can handle these kinds of cases.
Yeah. And you mentioned that, a lot of this is being done abroad. We have this latest news here, which is it turns out El Chapo's sons appear to be negotiating some kind of deal with the U.S. government. The lawyer finally confirmed that, yes, both Ovidio and Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son, are negotiating to try to maybe make a deal. I think they're going to roll on people connected to El Mayo, maybe some politicians, something to keep an eye on. But again, this is driven by what you say, right? These are people trying to make splashy headlines, make career cases, really kind of shine in that system. There's a lot of this bravado. There's a show called Billions where they actually kind of expose a little bit of how some of these district attorneys actually think and operate. They're not just in pursuit of justice as they claim, right? So this is something to keep an eye on, something we're going to be watching as the news develops when it comes, because we'll see. I mean, who are they going to roll on? What names are going to emerge? Who's going to be stained by this? Something to pay a lot of attention to. All right, moving on. So now we're going to talk about Trump's lies on auto plants.
I stopped the auto plant in Mexico. I personally stopped it. It was going to be a big, big auto plant, and I did it myself.
People are saying that...
Sorry if I think that's provoking trauma.
Who doesn't do a Trump impression?
I'm not saying mine is
too easy.
But,
So Trump has been on the campaign trail, and I can't believe the election is less than 2 weeks away at this point. It'll be good to finally be over with that and not have to deal with the incessant news about the two capitalist parties competing to see who's going to exploit the workers and who's going to better carry out genocide. But Trump has been using this talking point quite consistently, actually saying that I'm the reason that the Chinese automakers stopped their plans for auto plants here in Mexico. That's a flat out lie. And it's important to emphasize this because it's just not getting enough coverage. I mean, just the other day, he was in an interview, obviously one of these kind of, we shouldn't consider them, stars of journalism here, but getting away with these lies consistently. Very few people, your tweet up here talking about what he's, basically inventing. We'll let the video run. You can see this, I guess it's a render or an AI generated image. Yeah. And some people are convinced that, oh, no, that's what they were going to build.
They made up a fake Chinese car plant in Mexico. Find me that plant. Find us that plant, please. And we'll make you a great Mexican meal if you find that plant. We'll come to your house and do it.
So, of course, a lot of this is it's motivated by, politics and by his interest of trying to portray himself as the defender of American jobs, of blue collar, unionized wages, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is actually more complex, right? I mean, the U.S. automakers are worried. You were just mentioning to me that on your way over here to Mexico City, that you passed a BYD dealership in Oaxaca.
In Oaxaca, a southern state with the second poorest state in Mexico. There's a BYD dealership in Oaxaca. They're everywhere, baby. Right? China wants to enter into the Mexican market, not as the Trumpists would have you believe, because they want to then, flood the U.S. market with cars. Because they generally want to win the Mexican market, the national market, the domestic market in Mexico. Because this is what the Trumpists would have you believe, that they're shipping over cars. They want to ship over cars, basically totally, done. The last turn of the screw done in Mexico, you can then claim it's a Mexican-made car and then flood the U.S. market. Right? What they're trying to do is take their own U.S. brand of paranoia. Remember that seminal essay, the paranoid style in U.S. politics? The particular brand where U.S.ers have to be always paranoid against somewhere, somebody, sometime, someplace. Always. There has to be paranoia always. So another paranoia is against, Russia and China. And they think they're going to use Mexico as a backdoor to flood the market. Actually, China has been, had a very concerted strategy in the global south across the board, right? Because they're making cars people want at better prices, right? You would think that the free traders in the U.S. would let the Chinese cars in so that the U.S. automakers can up their game. But instead, right? It's only free trade for the poor. It's always protectionism for the wealthy. So they're going to protect the big three, and they're going to protect the, Tesla, heavily subsidized Tesla by the U.S. taxpayer. Well, Mexico doesn't have to do that. Just because the United States is paranoid and wants to put up tariff barriers against China, Mexico doesn't have to do it. And Mexico's not going to do it. Mexico's not going to do it. Mexico can have U.S. cars. Mexico can have Chinese cars. And Mexico can make its own cars, as we talked about in last week's episode. And what Mexico could not do is cede, right, give in to bully tactics and this fake narrative, right, that Mexico can't import anything from China, and we have to ensure that no Chinese company is built because all they want to do is use Mexico as a staging point for the United States, as if the Mexican domestic market didn't even exist, right? As if Mexicans don't drive and buy cars and, have an interest in electric cars and the like, okay? Because Mexicans don't exist. Mexicans don't have agency, right, Jose Luis?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also obeys the logic of a different kind of conception when it comes to the political economy of Mexico, right? There was this, effort to try to make Mexico, a source of cheap labor where you can get things built for cheap or assembled for cheap, or cheap natural resources, right? Primary goods.
That's it.
There's a change now, right? Like let's build the value added things here, like we talked about last week. Let's have these auto plants be here for a domestic market. Let's cultivate the domestic market, right? If they're going to act in a protectionist way and not let products flow based on their own arguments from decades ago, saying that this was going to solve the world's problems, well then fine, then we can also continue to develop that domestic market and also have a different relationship with the rest of the world. And we'll get into this in the losers and haters because there's quite a doozy.
Comes right back. Yeah.
But the truth is that Mexico is free to have a healthy commercial relationship with China. It's actually pretty small, relatively speaking, but there is a closeness there that wasn't there before. Because under the governments, under the neoliberal regime, there was this emphasis like, if you're going to be an ally of the United States, you have to not be an ally of Russia, not be an ally of China, don't pursue relationships with them, don't sign agreements with them, line up with us with our regime change plots, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we're seeing is a shift, which is entirely within our rights and hopefully leads to more affordable vehicles, more environmentally friendly vehicles. For example, it's not exclusively private vehicles. Like there's been a huge partnership here in Mexico City with Yutong, which makes buses. Mm-hmm. And most of the fleet here in Mexico City has been renewed with efficient electric vehicles. The bus line that's closest to me uses 100% electric vehicles. And that's the difference of having a healthy relationship with other parts of the world, not necessarily counting on only U.S. firms because they happen to be our neighbor. Sure, let's have a positive relationship with them, but it can't be limited to only them.
Absolutely right.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our next topic here, which is 1 million new homes. Imagine that. So Claudia Sheinbaum actually started her campaign promising 500,000 homes, and now throughout the campaign actually increases it. I think heard the feedback from us. Remember we said?
Right? We said 500,000 is good, but it's not enough.
So Venezuela can build 5 million.
They doubled it. You say, we've got a direct line to the presidency, people. So, right here. This is the power. Right here.
Yeah. So donate. Subscribe. Just kidding. So Claudia Sheinbaum has announced a new social program here to build new homes. And it's interesting because half of them will be built under the existing scheme, which is called Infonavit. So basically workers here who in the formal economy contribute to a fund, and then that fund is then used to, in a sense, subsidize the building or the purchasing of homes. It doesn't cover the full amount, certainly in a place like Mexico City where, it's far more expensive to live and buy, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is that part, but also the other half is for people in the informal economy who don't have access to the same programs. The idea is to actually follow through on that human right, here's that topic again, to housing, and actually being consistent on it and delivering it and not leaving everything to private industry. Because actually Mexico has a very long history of trying to solve the housing problem in cooperation with private industry, which ultimately ended up just being a cash transfer program for these construction firms in order for them to get rich and basically underdeliver and create shoddy housing.
Shoddy housing far away, right, from services, dumping them on municipalities that didn't have the resources to handle them, right? And then going belly up, right? Going belly up. They'd already got all this government cash, create shoddy housing in bad places. The whole system was set up so you could never get out of the debt trap of the mortgage, right? Almost like, subprime mortgages. So put it all together. poor quality housing, far away from services, in municipalities that didn't, assume the responsibility for them, right? Dangerous, and with loans that you would never pay back. You could be paying the monthly payment and you'd be stuck in that forever, like student loans for a lot of people in the US. So people did the logical thing. They walked away. So, some of these places now look like war zones. I've visited them. I've done videos on them for Oaxaca. Some of these places look like war zones, right? Barely 20 years after they were rolled out, right? Whereas you can go to some of the housing developments that were built earlier in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I rented for a time in the Iste subdivision in Oaxaca, built in the 70s. Houses are still fun.
Yeah.
And they're not much nicer homes, right? So this is the point here. And there's a couple of points to make here. First of all, it's not just going to be for people in the formal sector through the Iste. It's also going to be for people who are in the informal economy, which is practically half of Mexican workers, through the institution called the CONAVI. We've talked a lot about the importance that the benefits that are being rolled out are not only for formal sector workers, right? For example, the provision that people can retire with their last salary up to the average salary, right, of people in the formal sector, right? Well, that doesn't cover informal sector workers. So they're making the effort on this one so that it does cover informal sector workers. Another interesting benefit is that there are going to be social rents for these housing, capped, I believe, at 30% of your income. It's called a social rent. These things exist, with a right to buy after, I think, 10 years, right? So that rent you can then use towards the price of the home. It's a rent to buy program. You're not obligated to buy, but the option is there, and that rent can be used towards that. They also set up a system of inexpensive rents for young people who are just starting out, right, from 18 to 25, that they'll be able to rent for a number of years in these housing, at a below market rate, right? Interesting that housing can actually take a public form, right? And finally, that they're supposed to be well located, right? So President Sheinbaum has talked about the fact that they're going to look for tracts of land that are in the federal or state hands that are close to urban centers. You want, high quality, but, dense public housing near urban centers and near services, right? That's how you create good urban planning. In rural areas, it's different, and the rollout will be different, right? But in urban centers, to avoid sprawl, right, this is what you want to look for. And you said, if necessary, the federal government will actually acquire land. To avoid the problem of these, go outside of Mexico City, go to the state of Mexico. There are places where they're just miles of that Fox era housing.
Yeah, those
just
cookie cutter homes.
For miles, stretching for miles in all directions, right? So it just added to the problem of sprawl, right? And difficulty in services, and, lack of recreational spaces, lack of sporting, lack of quality of life, trees, all that stuff, right? So building on the experience of Claudia Sheinbaum with the Pilar community centers and with Mayor Clara Brugada with the Utopias, that has to be a key element as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the previous segment, I was talking about, a different conception about the role of the state in the economy. And this is another good example. You can't just leave everything to private initiative. There has to be an active protagonist role by the state in order to actually satisfy this human right. And I think in particular, one of the things that I liked that they said is that they're going to obviously target this where the need is the most. Right? It's not going to be, where it's most convenient so that they can unveil a plaque, but no, actually doing the work of figuring out where the need is. Obviously, places like Mexico City, but not exclusively so. There is a housing deficit in the southern states, similarly, because private industry doesn't want to build there because they don't make a lot of profit out of the homes there. And so actually intervening, saying we are going to step in and guarantee this. And I think it's a good start. 1 million, great, but we should go further.
Right, because it's a country of 126 million people, right? So, 1 million homes is still a limited program in the grand scheme of things. Remember what we talked about in last week's program? If you haven't watched last week's program, go watch last week's program. When we talked about how they're in process of amending the Constitution to allow the state oil company Pemex, the Federal Electricity Commission, to be fully public enterprises, right? Not subject to unnecessary competition rules or mercantile law. And one of the reasons is to allow the Federal Electricity Commission to provide internet to the entire country. To provide internet for the entire country, something that the private sector just wouldn't do, just like they didn't electrify the country. We talked about that last week. Housing is a similar situation, right? The market alone is not going to resolve the housing issue because there is no incentive for builders to build social housing. There isn't. They want to build high-end housing. They want to build condominiums. They want to build houses for speculation. We've seen this in country after country around the world. If left to their own devices, they will not build the housing that society needs. They just won't. It's so obvious and it's so clear. So then you get to a situation where there isn't the housing necessary. People are then fighting over insufficient housing, right? Rents go up, right? And then gentrification and, all the other related problems. And you get to a problem where, go to the United States City and see how people are sleeping in their cars or sleeping out in the street, right? In Mexico, you don't see as much of that because the family structure is tighter, but housing is no less of a problem here and in so many places. I mean, how many countries have we seen where there are, marches and there are demonstrations for housing? So many places. And I think this is an interesting way to go about it. And as we see here on the screen, one group of people isn't happy about it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the situation in Canada. I lived there for some years, and unfortunately, actually, the lack of housing is being weaponized by the right-wing forces in that country, saying, well, they let too many immigrants in, and that's why there's no housing, right? You can see how there's a very consequential political element to this. And as we see here on the screen, right, like there's a reason why private industry is opposed to it, right? This threatens their interests. It can actually have far more reaching repercussions than I think people can appreciate initially. So I'm really happy to see that this is one of the social programs that's going to be rolled out. And speaking of good news from Mexico and social programs, we got another one we wanted to share with you here today, which is the start of a new scholarship called the Rita Cetina Gutierrez Scholarship. And what this is going to do is a cash transfer program, very similar to the ones that rolled out in the previous government, which is just the universal social programs. Whoever wants to sign up is interested is eligible and can receive this new scholarship. And so this one is for secondary students, slowly rolling out as well. But the idea is to expand it. It's building on one of the more positive experiences here in Mexico City. Claudia Sheinbaum was formerly the mayor-governor of Mexico City, and she actually changed the old system. It was merit-based. So basically, the best and the brightest students received a scholarship. And ultimately, what that does is just reinforce existing social inequalities. And so when she came into office, she said, no, we need to have a different approach. Instead of just these merit-based scholarships for the best and the brightest, these are going to be universal scholarships for every student who's in public school, so that they have at least a bare minimum when it comes to making sure you can afford supplies and uniforms and transportation, all this kind of stuff, a meal, so that there is a healthier learning environment. And they're rolling this out and making this into a nationwide program now.
I think that's such an important ideological difference. I think that encapsulates so much.
Yeah.
That the previous scholarship system was grades-based, right? And that the high performers got scholarships. And if you follow that logic, it's logical. You should reward students who do well, right? But we know now from a host of studies that academic performance is inextricably tied to socioeconomic status. It's just so clear, right? Students that have 3 meals a day, students that have parents who have time to help them with their homework, right? Students that don't have to work after school, right? Or help in the store, or a host of other things, right? I remember my grandfather, who grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, one of 8, right, told me that one of his jobs was to light and put out the gas lights that they had in the time, right? The street lights were gas, right? Yeah. So you have to do that late at night, and then you have to get up really early and do it again, right? Light them and put them out. So he wound up falling asleep in class. Yeah. Said I wasn't a good student because I fell asleep in class because I had to do the gas lights. Yeah. And that's just the way it is. It's just so clear. So what the previous system was doing was aggravating those differences. Right? So that's a very important point. And I think another point to add to this is the kind of the integral approach of the Sheinbaum government to this kind of issue, right? So it's not just a stay-in-school scholarship. That's just the first step, right? The other step is, for example, to ensure that students have healthy food to eat, right? Because a big problem throughout Mexico, Mexicans have always liked their junk food and, soda, not new. But after NAFTA, the market was flooded by all this American stuff, Cheetos and Doritos. And my partner telling me, I have a lot of anecdotes today. My partner telling me, she grew up right across the street from a supermarket here in Oaxaca, there in Oaxaca, right? And once NAFTA was passed, all of a sudden there was this strange thing called Pop-Tarts. on the shelves. Never been there before. Pop-Tarts, right? Sugar bombs, right? Expensive as hell. And her family was not at all wealthy. Father was a taxi driver. And they begged and pleaded their mother, please buy us Pop-Tarts. So they finally gave in. They wore them down, got buy this Pop-Tart, and they didn't know what to do with it because they didn't have a toaster. So they're putting it on the comal, which is the big traditional, plate that they use to heat, right? And so they putting the Pop-Tart like this, and they were turning it over, and they burned one side of it, and they just bit into it, and they're like, "What is this? What is this?" Right? So one of the key target areas for the international junk food industry was, of course, schools, right? And you can speak to this more as a parent, right? So just a couple of days ago, the Sheinbaum administration came out with some new regulations, and the first thing, which I think is very important, is get the junk food out of the schools. Get the junk food out of the schools, right? Get it out, right? That's one. Second, provide incentives for parents' commissions to provide water coolers. So there's drinkable water for students, because a lot of times students buy soda and get hooked on soda, and adults buy beer, get hooked on beer, simply because there just isn't water. There just isn't water in public places in Mexico. There aren't water coolers. You can't find water, so you have to buy water. So if you're going to buy water and buy a soda, well, you buy the soda, don't you? And it's just logical, right? So Mexicans are the largest consumers of bottled water in the world, I believe. And a lot of that is foreign companies like Danone, Coca-Cola products, which suck Mexican water out of the ground and then sell it back to Mexicans in the form of bottled water, their own water from their own aquifers. How about that for a racket? So provide water coolers in schools. And then also they're looking on extending the school day to provide sports and recreational activities for students, which traditionally haven't existed, because in a lot of Mexican schools, they have dos turnos. Yeah. They have two sessions. They have the morning session, the afternoon session, to take advantage of the buildings. So you go to the morning session and the afternoon session. So there's no space or opportunity to go for recreation or workshops or whatever else. You go to your classes and that's it. You go home, because the afternoon kids are coming in, right, Jose Luis?
Plus, the actual infrastructure isn't the same, right? You think of a school and you think of a soccer field and the football stadium and the gym, and all that doesn't exist here in the schools. And I think a lot of it is a more lengthy process of the underinvestment in education. I know Claudia said that she wants to be remembered as the president who most invested in education. So hopefully we'll also see some infrastructure investments here. But for example, right, like one of the changes that happened is that the decisions in terms of where the budget is being spent when it comes to infrastructure schools is actually made by the parents themselves. It's an interesting model. We see this here. What they're actually going to try to do is incentivize, maybe provide rebates or make it more affordable, but basically so that the parents themselves are the ones who decide, all right, we're going to invest in this and bring drinkable water. I know here at home every day we have to tell the kid, fill up your water bottle, otherwise you're not going to have school or water at school all day, right? Because they don't have that at his school. And so these are kind of things that are important in terms of healthiness, right? You mentioned that one of the things you were excited about with the Mañanera is this healthy lifestyle that they're going to try to promote, once a week on the actual Mañanera.
On the Monday Mañanera.
Yeah. And I wanted to just kind of talk about this in case you haven't heard about this, but here in Mexico, we have these sellos, these stamps, which basically warn you if a product is not good for you, right? As long as if it has a stamp, it means that it kind of exceeds too much sugar, too much sodium, too many calories.
That's a new thing. Didn't exist before Lopez Obrador, the warning labels.
They had been pushing to have these implemented, and the food industry, in quotes, because it's hard to say some of them, what they make is not really food, right, was really resistant because they know. Because now, here at home, we'll be watching a movie and we're like, let's go get a snack. You go to the store, everything has one of these stamps on it. It's very hard to eat healthy when this is what's available to you, right? But at least there's more consciousness around this, there's more awareness around it, this effort to do something about it, to say, eat healthier. And I was going to say, I'm going to pretend to be a right-wing pundit for a second. Oh, this big government telling us what we can or can't buy. How dare they? If I want to give my kids junk food, then I'm going to give them junk food. Sometimes it does take this kind of energy saying, no, this cannot be sold inside the school. You want to go get it? Go through the trouble, find it at the corner store, but we're not going to be selling these inside of schools anymore. I think that's the right thing to do.
I mean, just look at the numbers of obesity. I think Mexico has the second highest obesity rate in the world after the United States, right?
Childhood obesity,
right?
Childhood diabetes,
and so that generation in the 90s are adults now, and so you see all of that. The junk food binge now creates adults with a series of health problems that the health system has to take on, right? And this is part and parcel also of the idea of using schools, right, as a community focal point
Yeah.
to try to promote health in other ways as well. And that's this idea of dental revisions in schools, eye tests, right? Hearing. The basic stuff that I think we probably took for granted in elementary school, at least me in the United States, that they'd call us out, they'd send us to the nurse, we'd have to look in the little machine and do our little eye test, right? We'd have to do our hearing test, we'd have to put on the headphones and go, beep, and you feel like this, beep, you're like this, beep, like this. Or, they'd weigh us. I mean, it was all very rudimentary, but at least it was some kind of basic way of detecting health problems before they could affect academic performance and also lead to worse things, right? None of that's ever existed here, right? Or very little. Good. So this idea, right? And that's part and parcel of what we've talked about, the program that you were excited about of house-to-house health consultations for senior citizens, right? Which that's being rolled out. That's coming, right? Because the census is
already started.
That's happening.
They're
right?
hiring the doctors and nurses now.
Because of the fact that historically it's so expensive to go, if you don't have, health coverage, the half of the country in the informal sector, you have to go to a private doctor. And a private doctor now costs 800 to 1,000 pesos, $40 to $50. Where are you going to get that? Where are you going to get that? You can't. Or you go to the pharmacies that have adjacent doctors' consultations, right, for cheap. They are cheap, but they're more pill pushing sessions than actual legit doctor sessions. I mean, the doctors are competent, nothing against the doctors, but there's the implicit idea that they're selling you pharmaceuticals. That's why they're adjacent right to the pharmacies, and that's where people go. They go to the pharmacy consultations. That's where I've gone, right? If you can't pop out $50, I know it's in the States, doctors cost a lot more, but $50 is a lot of money here. It's a lot of money, right? So let's, as a first step, let's make sure that kids have basic revisions to catch things before they spiral out of control, and that older people before they wind up in the emergency room. Some logical stuff.
Makes sense to me. In fact, your anecdote about the test just reminded me. I remember I grew up in the States, and there was a certificate you can get signed by Bill Clinton if you did enough sports.
Oh.
That was back in the day.
There's an incentive for you.
What a role model for children.
Yeah.
All right. And, of course, our last segment today, losers and haters. Incredible.
Yeah, we got a good one.
As
always.
I saw a lot of chatter on social media about this one, so I'm glad we're able to address it here.
Yeah.
Under its new president, Mexico's foreign policy heads down a dangerous path by Arturo McField's Yescas, who's a Nicaraguan journalist who actually was close to the Sandinista government there, but ultimately broke and is basically your typical right-of-center liberal pundit. Everything that doesn't abide by Washington is bad, and everything that aligns with Washington is good, the usual.
Right? With all the fervor of a religious convert. Right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I would say it was not really religious, but probably his bank account has something to say.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Mexico's foreign policy is headed towards greater radicalization. The clues have been clear. Newly inaugurated President Claudia Sheinbaum has restricted the diplomatic work of the U.S. ambassador, humiliated the King of Spain.
Oh no, the Bourbon monarchy in 2024 was humiliated. Oh dear, oh no.
And appointed a new Secretary of Foreign Affairs known for his disturbing positions on Russia, Iran, and Cuba.
The bogeymen they always trundle.
And of course, I mean, we don't have to read too much more beyond that, but it gives you an idea of the position that this article is trying to put out there, this opinion piece. Basically saying, well, Mexico has taken an independent, autonomous, sovereign path when it comes to its foreign policy, and that is unacceptable because Washington doesn't like it. How dare you not be enemies with the enemies of the United States? That is basically the argument. You can get into it here, right? Saying how she invited Putin to her inauguration, that Mexico has turned a blind eye toward Iran.
Mexico invited every head of state with whom they have diplomatic relations to the inauguration.
That's how it works, right?
It's called protocol.
Diplomacy.
Yeah.
And it's funny, these lines here where they're actually quoting De La Fuente, the current foreign minister, when he was at the UN, saying, "We urge the United States to lift the unilateral sanctions against Iran, especially those that apply extraterritorially or to third states."
Pretty logical, right? Because it's against international law. Those things are against international law. Mexico is adhering to international law. I know that's an outdated concept in the days of genocide, right? The international law is a thing, but, at least nominally it still exists.
Yeah, exactly, right? Unilateral coercive measures are not legal. These extraterritorial policies are not legal. The U.S. does it because it's the world's bully. But Mexico's position is actually the correct position. Lift the sanctions on Iran, lift the sanctions on Cuba and the blockade of Cuba, lift the sanctions on Venezuela. That is the correct position, and that actually would lead to a better situation here in the hemisphere if it actually happened. But of course, none of that matters, right? What matters? U.S. foreign policy interests, national security doctrine. That is what this article is basically trying to defend and trying to cast Mexico as a rogue actor in the world these days because it refuses to align with Washington's foreign policy goals. And it's absurd. And in fact, just a little more on here on the Cuban regime, right? Mexico's alignment with the Cuban regime is serious and shameful. Mexico could be a relevant voice for defense of democracy, but for hers to continue supporting a dictatorship that has been in power for 65 years and hold more than 1,100 political prisoners. It has dared to declare that the U.S. must end its embargo and repair the damage over Cuba, according to a statement made by De La Fuente in 2020.
Because the embargo is illegal according to international law. They're not just pulling things out of their sleeve. And it's illegal according to international law.
Virtually every single country in the world rejects the blockade of Cuba. There has been votes every single year in the UN General Assembly, and a handful of countries vote against it. United States,
U.S. lackeys.
Ukraine, Israel, and I think some of those island countries also as well.
Right.
That's it. And then the other 190 plus vote to end the blockade. And we're seeing right now, and I think it's worth mentioning, right? Cuba's going through a very difficult moment. Economically, there's a very serious crisis. Tourism, which was a major source of foreign income, has obviously been impacted and hadn't really quite recovered since COVID. Biden decided to keep most of Trump's tightening of the screws. It is still listed as a country that supports terror, despite the fact that it actually played a key role in promoting peace in Colombia and facilitating negotiations. So, Mexico's position on this one has been clear. The people who are wrong at the United States, they need to end this illegal embargo of Cuba, especially right now. As we know, they're going in the midst of an electricity crisis. And I'm actually really happy and proud to report that Mexico is playing an active role in facilitating the recovery from that situation, helping them with technology, with supplies, with oil apparently is being sent there to help power the generators. So I'm glad to see that. And one final point that I wanted to mention on this topic is just that for those of you who are not aware, one of the role models for former President López Obrador was Lázaro Cárdenas, who was president in the 30s, famous for expropriating the oil industry. After he retired from politics, the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, and he became a huge champion of the Cuban Revolution, of Fidel Castro, of the Cuban people, and actually becoming a very important voice in the international stage. López Obrador has retired from national politics, but I think it would be really good to see him to continue the role that he played when he was president in defending the Cuban people, the Cuban Revolution, and all of its advances. In fact, he was awarded the José Martí Medal for his efforts. So possibly we'll see him doing that kind of work. I think it'd be kind of apropos, right? Following in the footsteps of Lázaro Cárdenas. And I think it's important to always to show our solidarity with the people of Cuba, and might as well say it, of Venezuela as well, who are also suffering under the oppression of U.S. foreign policy, which, again, all right, Venezuela, they decided to opt for an independent path, like Mexico is, pursuing national liberation, and are being severely punished for it. And we hope that stops, but also because this is how international relations should be handled, right? Countries should be free to pursue their own independent policies, their own economic path, their own relationships with other countries, and not have to, be shamed in these honestly laughable kinds of articles.
Well, it's a point that goes back to what we were talking about with regards to the car issue and Trump, right? The United States wants Mexico to adhere to its foreign policy with regards to China and not Mexico's policy with regards to China. Mexico wants amicable relations with both, right? But through the car issue, they're trying to bludgeon Mexico into either directly or indirectly adopting the U.S. protectionist paranoia against China. Well, here's what a lot of people don't know about the sanctions against Cuba, right? It's not just the U.S. sanctioning Cuba. It's anyone else who tries to do business with Cuba, right? If you're a European business, if you've pointed out, Jose Luis, that tries to, do business with Cuba, the U.S. will slap you. The U.S. will slap you with sanctions. It's the same thing. It's the U.S. exporting its foreign policy onto third parties and third countries. Right?
Yep. And of course, it all is summed up here in this last paragraph. Right? Mexico is on the path towards less democracy, less autocracy, less diplomacy, and greater ideological turbulence. All of that is untrue. There's more democracy. We're electing our judges here. There is less autocracy. There is more of a devolving of power into the hands of parents at school so they can decide how they want to spend the resources. In fact, Mexico's advocacy in the Western Hemisphere has allowed it to actually play a helpful role in conflicts, as we talked about previously on the program. All right, Kurt. Well, that brings us to the end of another program.
It's Jose Luis, though.
Oh, right. So,
Jose Luis, can I say that? Mexican-born journalist? No, wait, I'm sorry.
No. Who do I write for?
Jacobin?
Jacobin?
Sentido Común?
I think I pitched once to Jacobin.
Oh. Why didn't you answer him?
They actually did.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
It just didn't work out. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us in another episode of Soberania. As always, like and subscribe, tell your friends, and a special thank you to all of our supporters in the St. Patrick's Battalion who are betraying the U.S. empire by supporting Soberania here in Mexico. We really appreciate the support. It helps us keep us going. Kurt, any last words?
My name is Kurt Hackbarth, I think. Join us next week for another edition of Soberania.